Number 10. The Book of Thoth. Few forbidden books are as elusive or as suggestive as the Book of Thoth. Unlike a surviving manuscript that can be placed in a museum or studied line by line, the Book of Thoth exists in a stranger category, part legend, part literary tradition, part symbol of knowledge that human beings were never meant to possess too easily. In ancient Egyptian imagination and later esoteric tradition, it became associated with the god Thoth, the divine figure linked to writing, wisdom, measurement, sacred language, and hidden understanding. That alone would have made any text bearing his name powerful. But the stories surrounding this book pushed it far beyond ordinary wisdom. According to later traditions, the Book of Thoth contained extraordinary knowledge, the language of animals, the secrets of the heavens, mastery over the forces of the earth, and insight into realities hidden from ordinary people. In some accounts, to read it was to cross a boundary, gaining access to truths that elevated the mind while also inviting danger, punishment, or ruin. This is what makes the legend so perfect for a list like this. The Book of Thoth was not feared merely because it was rare. It was feared because it represented knowledge without permission. That distinction matters. Throughout history, forbidden books have often been dangerous, not because they were physically threatening, but because they challenged who was allowed to know, interpret, and control reality. The Book of Thoth fits that pattern in almost mythic form. Even if no single surviving volume can be cleanly identified as the book in the modern sense, the persistence of the legend tells us something important. Ancient cultures were deeply aware that knowledge itself could be treated as sacred, restricted, and potentially destructive. Wisdom was not always imagined as something to be spread freely. Sometimes it was guarded, sometimes it was hidden, and sometimes stories warned that certain truths carried a cost. That is why the Book of Thoth belongs on this list, even in its ambiguity. Its historical force lies less in one recoverable object than in what it symbolizes. The ancient belief that writing could preserve more than information. It could preserve access, power, transformation. A text linked to divine intelligence was never just a book. It was a threshold. And that is what makes it so haunting. The Book of Thoth may not survive in the neat, literal way people often hope for when they hear the phrase. But as a legend of forbidden wisdom, it may preserve something even more revealing. The idea that some forms of knowledge were considered too potent to circulate openly, too sacred to be ordinary, and too dangerous to belong to everyone. In that sense, the Book of Thoth is the perfect place to begin. Because before books were banned by institutions, burned by conquerors, or buried by frightened communities, there was already a much older fear waiting in the background. What if the page itself could reveal more than the human mind was meant to bear? Number 9. The Sibylline Books. In ancient Rome, there were some texts that could be consulted only when the state itself trembled. These were the Sibylline Books, a collection of prophetic writings so deeply tied to crisis, ritual, and political authority that they became one of the most mysterious bodies of sacred knowledge in the Roman world. They were not public reading. They were not open scriptures. They were stored, guarded, and approached only under special circumstances, usually when Rome faced disaster, omens, war, plague, or some rupture serious enough to demand ritual response on a national scale. That restricted status is exactly what makes them feel forbidden. The traditional story tells of prophetic books offered to a Roman king by a mysterious woman, often identified as the Sibyl, whose terrifying calm and escalating demands turned the transaction into legend. Whether every detail of that story is historical matters less than what it reveals. From the beginning, these books were framed as rare, powerful, and not meant for casual hands. They were eventually placed under priestly control, and access to them was shaped by state power. What mattered was not just what they said, but who was allowed to ask. And that is one of the oldest forms of prohibition in history. A book does not need to be openly condemned to become inaccessible. It can simply be placed behind ritual, authority, and fear. The Sibylline books were believed to contain guidance for moments when ordinary order failed. They were not daily instruction. They were emergency wisdom, activated only when the known world began to crack. In that sense, they occupied a strange position between religion and political control. Rome did not merely preserve them because they were old. Rome preserved them because they were useful, dangerous, and symbolically powerful. Prophecy, especially prophecy tied to state action, could never be treated as neutral knowledge. And then, like so many texts of immense influence, they were lost. The original books did not survive intact. Later collections, replacements, and fragments complicate the story. But the aura of the Sibylline books comes from exactly this combination: sacred restriction, political power, controlled access, and eventual disappearance. They became the kind of text history remembers most vividly when it can no longer read it directly. That only intensifies their forbidden quality. We know they mattered. We know they were guarded. We know they were consulted in moments of deep fear. But the words themselves no longer stand in front of us in the form Rome once feared and revered. That absence is part of the power, because the Sibylline books remind us that some of history's most consequential writings were never banned in the modern sense. They were simply held so close to power that ordinary people could not approach them. In practice, that can make a text just as unreachable as one condemned to flames. And that is why they belong near the beginning of this list. They show that forbidden books are not always the ones shouted down as heresy. Sometimes they are the ones the state quietly keeps for itself, waiting to open them only when the future becomes too frightening to face without hidden words. Number 8. The Nag Hammadi texts. Some forbidden books are feared because they predict too much. Others are feared because they tell an entirely different story. That is what makes the Nag Hammadi texts so extraordinary. Discovered in Egypt in the 20th century, this hidden cache of ancient writings revealed a body of religious thought that had not simply faded from view by accident. These texts seemed to belong to worlds of belief that had once existed close to early Christianity and the wider spiritual currents of late antiquity, yet were later pushed outside the boundaries of what became accepted, preserved, and publicly transmitted as orthodox truth. That is where their power begins. The Nag Hammadi library includes works associated with Gnostic traditions, and what makes many of them so unsettling is not just their rarity, but their world view. In these writings, the structure of reality can feel unstable, hidden, layered, even hostile. Knowledge is not merely moral instruction or communal guidance. It is awakening, escape, revelation. A key to understanding that the visible world is not the whole story. In some of these texts, salvation depends less on obedience and more on hidden understanding, less on public doctrine and more on access to truths concealed from the ordinary believer. That alone would have made such writings dangerous in any age trying to establish one authorized version of spiritual reality. And that is the deeper reason they belong on this list. The Nag Hammadi texts were not simply old books buried in the ground. They represent ideas that appear to have been preserved precisely because leaving them exposed may have meant losing them forever. Whether they were hidden in response to active suppression, changing religious power, or the broader narrowing of acceptable doctrine, the result is the same. These texts survived not by remaining visible, but by disappearing from ordinary circulation. That gives them the unmistakable aura of forbidden knowledge. Because when a civilization chooses which books to copy, teach, and defend, it is also choosing which voices will be forgotten. The Nag Hammadi texts reveal that early religious history was more diverse, contested, and philosophically unstable than later certainty often suggests. They show that other interpretations existed, other maps of the divine, other answers to the nature of the soul, matter, creation, and redemption. To preserve those alternatives would have been to preserve competing claims to truth itself, and that is why their rediscovery felt so disruptive. These books did not merely add new information. They reopened old possibilities. They reminded the modern world that whole branches of ancient spiritual imagination had once flourished before being edged out of the surviving mainstream. The fact that they had to be unearthed from concealment only strengthens that effect. They came back not as comfortable additions to history, but as witnesses from a version of the past that had nearly been sealed shut. That is what makes the Nag Hammadi texts so haunting. They are not just forbidden because someone may once have rejected them. They are forbidden because they expose how fragile official memory can be, and how much of human belief survives only when someone hides it before history closes the door. Number 7. The Voynich Manuscript. If some forbidden books were suppressed because people feared what they contained, the Voynich Manuscript is disturbing for almost the opposite reason. No one can say with confidence what it contains at all. That uncertainty has made it one of the most famous and unnerving manuscripts in the world. Its pages are filled with strange script unreadable to any established tradition of scholarship, accompanied by bizarre illustrations of plants, circular diagrams, astronomical-looking forms, and enigmatic scenes involving figures and symbols that seem to suggest a system of meaning just beyond comprehension. The manuscript looks deliberate, dense, structured. It has the visual authority of a real book of knowledge, and yet its knowledge remains locked away. That is what gives the Voynich manuscript its special place on a list like this. It may not be forbidden in the conventional sense of being condemned by church, state, or empire, but it functions like a forbidden book because it denies access. It presents itself as something encoded, withheld, or fundamentally unreachable. The result is almost more unsettling than open censorship. A banned book tells you that someone wanted its contents suppressed. The Voynich manuscript leaves you facing an even stranger possibility, that the text survived, but meaning itself did not. That creates a very different kind of fear, because the manuscript seems to promise that there is something there. Not random marks, not obvious nonsense, but an underlying order that has resisted generations of attempts to break it. Cryptographers, linguists, historians, and amateur codebreakers have all been drawn into its gravity. Some think it may preserve a genuine encoded system. Others suspect a sophisticated hoax. Some imagine lost medical, botanical, alchemical, or esoteric knowledge. Others believe it may be an elaborate work built precisely to imitate depth without ever yielding it, and that unresolved status is exactly why it belongs here. The Voynich manuscript stands at the edge where forbidden knowledge and unknowable knowledge begin to overlap. It is not powerful because we know what it says. It is powerful because it continues to suggest that something may be hidden behind its surface, and because our inability to reach that hidden layer has transformed the manuscript into a symbol of intellectual exclusion. It does not merely refuse to speak. It forces us to confront how much authority a text can hold even when its language is closed. In a way, the manuscript has become its own kind of sealed archive. If it is genuine, then it may preserve a system of thought or encoded communication disconnected from the traditions that could explain it. If it is false, then it is one of history's most successful simulations of secret knowledge. Either possibility is unsettling. One suggests lost understanding. The other suggests humanity's deep desire to believe in lost understanding. And perhaps that is what makes the Voynich manuscript so fitting for this list. It is a forbidden book not because someone burned it or locked it away, but because it sits in plain sight while remaining effectively inaccessible. It survived. It can be opened. Its pages can be studied. But the knowledge it appears to hold is still somewhere on the other side of the page, waiting like a door no one has yet been able to unlock. Number 6. The Books of Enoch. Some books become forbidden because they claim to reveal what human beings were never supposed to witness. That is what gives the Books of Enoch such enduring power. Attributed to Enoch, the mysterious biblical figure who walked with God and then vanished from ordinary human fate, these writings open the door to a world of fallen angels, cosmic rebellion, heavenly secrets, divine judgment, and hidden structures of the universe. They do not read like cautious moral instruction. They feel like the record of someone being shown too much. And that is exactly why they became so controversial. The books of Enoch occupy a strange place in religious history. They were influential in parts of ancient Jewish thought and left a deep mark on early religious imagination. Yet they did not remain within the familiar canonical boundaries of most later traditions. That alone makes them fascinating. A text can be widely known, deeply influential, and still end up pushed to the edge of legitimacy. The result is a book that survives in fragments of influence even where its authority was denied or reduced. What makes these writings especially unsettling is the kind of knowledge they claim to preserve. In Enochic tradition, the boundary between heaven and earth is not stable. Divine beings descend. Forbidden instruction is given. Humanity receives knowledge tied to power, corruption, and cosmic disorder. The world becomes charged with the idea that some knowledge was never neutral to begin with. It could elevate, destroy, or deform. It could reveal truths that were too high, too dangerous, or too destabilizing for ordinary human life. That theme places the books of Enoch directly in the lineage of forbidden knowledge. These are not merely old religious writings that fell out of common use. They are texts built around the terrifying possibility that revelation itself can become transgressive. What happens when heaven shares too much? What happens when hidden things become visible before humanity is ready? Those are not just theological questions. They are the central fear behind many forbidden books across history. And that fear may help explain why such writings became uneasy material for later religious boundaries. Institutions that seek clarity, order, and authoritative teaching are rarely comfortable with books that overflow with visionary cosmology, unstable angelology, and stories of knowledge arriving through dangerous breach. Even when not openly banned in the simplistic sense, texts like these often become marginal, suspect, or selectively preserved, surviving in traditions that continue to guard them while disappearing from others. That is part of what makes them so compelling. The books of Enoch are not hidden because they are empty. They are hidden because they are too full of cosmic structure, too full of beings crossing sacred lines, too full of explanations for evil, judgment, and the corruption of the world that do not fit neatly into later systems. And that is why they belong here. They remind us that some of history's most unsettling books were feared not because they rejected the sacred, but because they claimed to enter it too deeply. They offered a vision of reality in which secret knowledge does not simply enlighten. It changes the order of the world. Number 5. The Hermetic Corpus. Some forbidden books do not threaten power through prophecy or open heresy. They threaten it by offering an entirely different way of understanding reality. That is what makes the Hermetic Corpus so important. These writings, associated with the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus, stand at the crossroads of philosophy, mysticism, sacred cosmology, and hidden wisdom. They speak of the nature of the divine mind, the structure of the cosmos, the soul's descent into matter, and the possibility that true understanding comes not through public instruction alone, but through inner awakening and esoteric insight. This is not ordinary knowledge. It is knowledge meant to transform the one who receives it. And that transformation is precisely what has always made such texts difficult to classify. The Hermetic writings were not always condemned in the same direct way as openly heretical literature, but they often lived in a charged and unstable space. In some periods, they were revered as ancient wisdom, keys to lost truth older than established religious or philosophical systems. In other periods, they were treated with suspicion, associated with occult practice, dangerous speculation, or teachings too close to magical and heterodox currents. That ambiguity is part of their power. The Hermetic corpus survives on the border between venerated wisdom and knowledge many authorities would rather keep at a distance. What makes these texts especially fitting for this list is the kind of authority they claim. Hermetic thought does not merely describe the world. It suggests that the visible world is only the lower surface of a much deeper spiritual structure, and that human beings can ascend through knowledge into a more divine form of awareness. In that framework, hidden knowledge becomes sacred technology. To know is not just to learn, it is to become. That is one of the oldest reasons books become dangerous. Because if a text teaches that truth can be accessed through inner illumination, symbolic interpretation, and direct realization rather than through institutions alone, then control over truth becomes harder to maintain. A book like that does not only offer information, it redistributes authority. It implies that the deepest structures of reality are available to those initiated into the right kind of understanding, not merely to the guardians of accepted doctrine. That helps explain why Hermetic writings have moved in and out of favor across centuries. They have inspired philosophers, mystics, alchemists, and seekers of hidden knowledge, while also drawing fear and mistrust from those wary of teachings that blur the lines between theology, philosophy, and esoteric practice. Even when copied, studied, or admired, they often carry an aura of restricted wisdom, as though they are not meant to be approached casually, but entered like a chamber of dangerous light. And that is why the Hermetic corpus belongs so high on this list. It represents a category of forbidden book that history never quite succeeds in destroying, yet never fully allows to become ordinary. These writings survive because they continue to offer something too compelling to vanish. The promise that beneath the visible world lies a hidden order, and that the right words, read in the right spirit, might allow a human being to remember what reality really is. That possibility has always been powerful, and power that changes how people see the world is rarely allowed to circulate without resistance. Number 4. The Codex Gigas. Some books become forbidden because of what they say. Others become forbidden because of what people believe must have helped create them. That is what gives the Codex Gigas its terrifying reputation. Often called the Devil's Bible, this enormous medieval manuscript is famous not only for its immense size, but for the dark legend attached to it, that it was completed in a single night by a monk who made a pact with the devil. The story is almost certainly not true in any literal sense, but the fact that such a story took hold at all tells us something important. This was not a manuscript people experienced as ordinary. It looked too vast, too strange, too charged with symbolic force. The Codex Gigas contains biblical material, historical texts, medical writings, penitential matter, and more, making it in one sense a massive compilation rather than a single secret document. But that is exactly what makes its reputation so interesting. Forbidden books are not always forbidden because every page is heretical. Sometimes they become feared because they gather too much authority, too much visual shock, too much symbolic intensity into one object. In the case of the Codex Gigas, no feature embodies that more powerfully than the famous full-page image of the devil, one of the most unforgettable illustrations in medieval manuscript culture. That image transformed the manuscript's identity. Because once a book is associated with infernal power, secrecy, and impossible creation, people stop encountering it only as text. They begin encountering it as an object of dread. A manuscript like that no longer sits comfortably among ordinary books. It becomes an artifact surrounded by aura, rumor, and spiritual unease. Even if the historical reality is more grounded, years of labor, monastic discipline, scribal effort, the legend tells us how the book was felt. It was too large, too singular, too unsettling to remain neutral. And that emotional force matters. The Codex Gigas belongs on this list, not because it was formally banned in the simplest sense, but because it entered the category of dangerous books through association, fear, and symbolic excess. It came to represent the idea that a text could be spiritually contaminated, or at least dangerously close to powers people preferred not to name directly. In a world where books already carried sacred weight, a manuscript of that scale and strangeness could easily cross into the territory of forbidden fascination. That is part of what makes it so haunting. It is a reminder that a book does not need to be lost to become untouchable. It can survive in full view and still feel sealed off by its own legend. People can study it, preserve it, and display it, while still sensing that it belongs to a darker category of knowledge, one where piety, fear, punishment, and forbidden imagination all overlap. And perhaps that is why the Codex Gigas still feels unsettling even now, because beneath the folklore, it preserves a very old anxiety. What if a book can become too large, too charged, too powerful to remain just a book? Number 3. The books burned at Alexandria. Some forbidden books are feared so deeply that they are hidden. Others are feared so broadly that entire libraries disappear with them. That is what makes the books burned at Alexandria such a devastating entry on this list. Unlike a single manuscript with a known title, these lost works represent something much larger. The possibility that entire worlds of knowledge can vanish not one page at a time, but by the collapse, destruction, neglect, or fragmentation of the institutions meant to protect them. The Library of Alexandria has become the greatest symbol in history of knowledge. Humanity failed to keep. And that symbolism is powerful for a reason. Whether people imagine it as one catastrophic burning or a longer, more complex process of decline and loss, Alexandria stands for a civilizational nightmare. A place that may once have housed vast collections of philosophy, science, mathematics, history, poetry, geography, religion, drama, and forgotten intellectual traditions becomes a story not of preservation, but of erasure. What was lost there may never be listed fully, and that uncertainty only magnifies the horror. A destroyed object is tragic. A destroyed archive is almost immeasurable. That is why this case belongs so high on the list. The books of Alexandria were not forbidden in one narrow sense. Many were not banned individually by name, but the knowledge they represented fell victim to something equally destructive: war, political upheaval, changing power, cultural indifference, and the fragile dependence of memory on institutions that can fail. And once knowledge is no longer copied, protected, and valued, it can vanish just as completely as if someone had ordered it burned on purpose. That is one of the darkest truths in history, because erasure does not always arrive as censorship announced aloud. Sometimes it arrives through conquest, sometimes through neglect, sometimes through the slow death of the places where books live. Alexandria reminds us that one of the most effective ways to silence knowledge is not merely to condemn a text, but to destroy the environment that allows thousands of texts to survive together. The result is almost unbearable to imagine. Lost plays, lost histories, lost philosophical schools, lost scientific observations, lost arguments, lost worlds of language and thought that may have shaped humanity differently if they had endured. We speak of Alexandria not only because of what it was, but because of what its destruction represents: the permanent shrinking of the human conversation. And that is what makes it feel forbidden in the deepest sense. Not because every book there contained dangerous secrets, but because so much knowledge can become inaccessible forever once the structures of preservation are broken. The books burned at Alexandria are the ultimate image of history trying to erase ideas, not always cleanly, not always intentionally, but effectively enough that what vanished can never be fully recovered. That is why Alexandria haunts the imagination more than almost any other lost archive. It forces us to confront a terrifying possibility: that some of humanity's greatest thoughts did not survive long enough to become famous. They simply disappeared into the dark with the shelves that once held them. Number 2. The Popol Vuh. Some forbidden books were feared because they challenged power. Others became forbidden simply because they belonged to the wrong people at the wrong moment in history. That is what makes the Popol Vuh so important. This is not just a text. It is one of the greatest surviving records of Quiché Maya thought, preserving myth, creation, ancestry, divine struggle, sacred identity, and a worldview that might otherwise have been far more severely erased. In its pages, gods speak, worlds are made and remade, failed creations are abandoned, and the famous hero twins move through trials that feel at once mythic, symbolic, and deeply tied to cultural memory. The Popol Vuh is a masterpiece of imagination, but it is also something more fragile than that. It is a survivor, and that is exactly why it belongs so high on this list. The Popol Vuh comes from a world that faced conquest, forced religious transformation, cultural suppression, and the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems on a massive scale. When empires conquer, they do not only seize land, they often try to reorganize memory. They decide which stories become legitimate, which gods become false, which languages become secondary, and which texts are no longer allowed to shape the future. In that kind of world, a native sacred text becomes dangerous by existing. The Popol Vuh survived through transcription and transmission under conditions where much more could easily have been lost. That is what gives it its forbidden quality. It was not merely an old manuscript lying forgotten in a neutral archive. It belonged to a civilizational inheritance that stood in tension with the forces trying to replace it. To preserve such a text was, in a sense, to preserve an entire way of seeing reality, creation, divinity, ancestry, and human meaning outside the categories imposed by conquerors. That is one of the deepest forms of suppression in history. Not just the burning of books, but the pressure to make a people forget how they once understood the world. And yet the Popol Vuh endured. That endurance matters because it shows how close human knowledge often comes to disappearing. When we read surviving sacred texts from colonized or threatened cultures, we are not just reading literature, we are reading against erasure. The Popol Vuh stands not only for what survived, but for everything around it that may not have. Other oral traditions, other written forms, other ceremonial knowledge, other intellectual worlds that were never given the chance to pass forward intact. That is why the Popol Vuh is more than a remarkable document. It is evidence that history does not erase all knowledge equally. Some traditions must survive in fragments, in hidden channels, or under the protection of those who know what will happen if they do not. The book carries an entire cosmology, but it also carries the shadow of everything that nearly silenced it. And that is what makes it so haunting, because the Popol Vuh reminds us that some forbidden books are not feared because they are evil or heretical in any simple sense. They are feared because they preserve a memory that conquest would rather replace. Number 1. The Dead Sea Scrolls. If any discovery captures the full power of hidden texts returning from the dark, it is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Buried in caves near the Dead Sea and preserved through astonishing circumstance, these manuscripts became one of the most important textual discoveries in modern history. Their significance was immediate and profound. Here were ancient Jewish writings, biblical manuscripts, sectarian texts, hymns, legal rules, commentaries, apocalyptic visions, and fragments of a world of religious thought far richer and more complex than many people had imagined. They did not just add detail to history, they changed the atmosphere around it. That is why they deserve the number 1 spot. The Dead Sea Scrolls embody nearly every theme that makes forbidden books so compelling. Concealment, survival, fragility, controversy, restricted access, and the unsettling realization that texts of immense importance can remain hidden for centuries while the world builds its certainty without them. Whether they were hidden deliberately for protection, lost through crisis, or left behind by a community living at the edge of historical upheaval, the result is the same. These writings survived because they vanished from ordinary view, and once they re-emerged, they forced history to widen. That is part of what makes them so powerful. The scrolls reveal a religious landscape full of tension, expectation, interpretation, and diversity. They remind us that ancient scriptural worlds were not static or simple. They were alive with competing emphases, sacred discipline, apocalyptic hope, legal seriousness, and different ways of imagining covenant, corruption, purity, and the end of days. The scrolls did not invent complexity. They revealed how much complexity had already been there. That revelation can be deeply unsettling, because forbidden books often disturb not by introducing something completely alien, but by showing that the past was never as tidy as later generations wanted it to be. The Dead Sea Scrolls carry exactly that force. They expose depth, context, variation. They pull sacred history closer to the messy human reality of communities preserving texts, arguing through interpretation, and trying to protect what they believed mattered most in an unstable world. And their modern history only strengthens that aura. Disputes over access, publication delays, intense scholarly attention, and public fascination helped turn the scrolls into more than an archaeological discovery. They became a symbol of hidden truth arriving slowly, incompletely, and under conditions that made people wonder what else had been buried, what else had been withheld, and how much of the past had remained outside normal reach for far too long. A forbidden book does not always need to be banned outright. Sometimes it becomes forbidden because access is narrow, meaning is guarded, and the text stands at the threshold of questions too large for comfortable answers. That is why the Dead Sea Scrolls are the perfect ending to this list, because they show us what happens when hidden writings survive long enough to speak again. They remind us that history is not only built from what was preserved in plain sight, it is also built from what was sealed away, almost lost, and recovered only by chance. In that sense, the scrolls are more than ancient documents. They are proof that some of the most important words in human history survive only because the earth kept them hidden until the world was ready to find them. And that possibility is as thrilling as it is unsettling. Because if the most important hidden texts could remain silent for 2,000 years, then we may still have no idea how much of the past is waiting, unread, in the dark.